What's up, everybody? My name's Pantsface, and today I want to talk about Shadow Priest Talents and Glyphs. Now, I primarily focus on PvE, so I'm not going to be talking about PvP at all, so I apologize if that's what you're looking for. But I do know a lot about PvE, and I think whether you're a new player or an advanced player, I'm going to share some things here that can help you out. Now, I'm going to talk through some set it and forget it talent setups and glyphs. So if you don't really care for all the nuanced, all the details, you can just set your talents and you'll be good to go. But also, if you're looking for a little bit more detail, you want to understand our talents and our glyphs and the options we have a little bit more, then I'm also going to dive into detail there. If you like this content, please consider liking and subscribing, as it helps me out a great deal and just allows me to keep producing content for you guys, and I'd like to continue to do that. So everything that you can do helps me out. All right, so with that out of the way, let's hop into it. So this talent setup that I have in front of you is really your standard set it and forget it talents. I've used this setup on every single fight in Wrath of the Lich King so far, and it's been perfectly fine. I wouldn't say it's ideal for every fight, but it's been perfectly fine. This is what I use for progression for Nax, for Ulduar. In like a speed run or a progression setting, you're not really changing your talents. You're basically using your one standard loadout. That's at least how I operate. And this talent setup suited me perfectly. Now, what are we getting here? We're getting basically all of the damage talents and then most of the mana regen talents. And we're kind of missing a little bit of the utility that we could otherwise get as a Shadow Priest. Now, let's just do a quick run through the Shadow Tree, and I'm just going to talk about the talents that we're missing as opposed to the ones that we actually have. So what are the talents that we haven't selected here? Shadow Affinity reduces your threat of your shadow spells, and you get mana back if your dots are dispelled, but that's really just a PvP effect. It doesn't really have any impact in PvE at all. So we don't need a more threat reduction because we get that with Shadow Form. We get 30% threat reduction already baked into Shadow Form, so we don't need more of it. Improved Psychic Scream and Silence are really just PvP talents. It's always nice to have a silence, but totally not necessary. It's something you could absolutely get, but again, it's just not really anything that Shadow needs to worry about. Mages and shamans really cover the ranged interrupts in most of the raids so far. And then finally, we have Psychic Horror, which again, another PvP talent. You terrify the target and it disarms them for 10 seconds. Really strong, but again, not anything that's useful in PvE. The other one is Improved Vampiric Embrace. Now, this is a niche talent that could definitely be picked up in some other circumstances depending on the fight and depending what your guild needs. If your guild's struggling on healing on maybe like XT hard mode when you're taking a lot of consistent damage from the life sparks, this could be a good way to help top up your party. So this definitely has some uses. It's just not something I'd recommend for your everyday talent setup. And then finally, we have 2 out of 3 points in Focused Mind. This is really going to depend on your gear, whether you're a newly geared Shadow Priest or you're, in a raid that doesn't have the highest DPS. In either of those circumstances, you might want 3 out of 3 points in here. And in that circumstance, I would take a point out of Improved Shadow Form. What Improved Shadow Form does is it allows your Fade to remove movement impairing effects, which is really nice, but it also gives you pushback protection. So 2 out of 2 Improved Shadow Form paired with Concentration Aura means you're never going to get spell pushback. So if you're never getting spell pushback, it's really nice on a lot of fights, but it's definitely not necessary on every fight. So that's more of a quality of life thing if mana is okay. But if you are struggling with mana, I would just put this point there instead. Going over to the disc tree, we get 5% increased damage on our instant spells, which is really nice. Improved Inner Fire just gives us a little bit more spell power from Inner Fire. Improved Power Word Fortitude gives us more stamina and increases the effect of our Power Word Fortitude. Meditation's really strong for mana regen. We really do need this. It's pretty hard to do most fights without this unless the fight's really, really short. And then Inner Focus is another talent that it's not a huge impact talent, but it is really nice if you pair it with Mind Flayer or Mind Sear, because it causes that entire channel to increase its crit by 25% chance. And that's for every tick on every enemy. So on Mind Sear, it can be a really chunky Mind Sear if you do it on like the Lashers for Freya, for example. Unfortunately, it doesn't snapshot with our dots, so you can't use it to get like a juiced up Shadow Word Pain or anything like that. Okay, so this is like our basic talent setup. And this is what I would recommend for, pretty much all PvE content. If you're not somebody who wants to min-max your talents, this is what I would recommend. Go for it, plug it in and don't look back. It's great. Talking about glyphs real quick in the set it and forget it section, I would go Glyph of Shadow, Glyph of Mindflay, Glyph of Dispersion. What you're getting here are Glyph of Shadow and Glyph of Mindflay are really the only two glyphs that have a DPS impact for Shadow. Shadow's kind of lacking in the damage glyph department, unfortunately, but Glyph of Shadow means your non-periodic spell critical strikes increase your spell power by 30% of your spirit. I think I have about 800 spirit right now, so that's about 240 spell power. Very nice. And then Glyph of Mindflay increases the damage done by your Mindflay spell by 10% when your target is afflicted with Shadow or Pain. So really strong, just 10% damage to Mindflay. Mindflays are filler, we're casting it a lot. Another really strong glyph. Glyph of Dispersion is a nice catch-all. Dispersion, it reduces damage you take. You can be a little bit more greedy with mechanics. It helps restore your mana. It's just a nice survival tool. And I find that this is the most useful on the widest variety of basis than other glyphs. And I'll go into more on glyphs in the advanced glyphs section. That'll be a little bit later in the video. All right, so this is, again, just set it and forget it. Glyph of Fortitude, Glyph of Shadow Fiend, Glyph of Levitate. Minor glyphs don't really matter. Kind of pick your preference, whatever you like. I would say Glyph of Shadow Fiend is really nice because if your Shadow Fiend dies, you get 5% of your mana back. So you might not get the full return from your Shadow Fiend being alive, but it's at least something. And the little Shadow Buddy, he doesn't die as often as he used to in TBC, but he does happen occasionally. So it's definitely a glyph that's worth having. Okay, now let's talk about what are some niche scenarios where we might want to change up our talents. This really is most specific to Hodir and Vezax in Ulduar. Now, this talent setup that I have here, let me make sure that my face isn't covering anything. Okay, good. So this talent setup here is what I use for Hodir and Vezax specifically. I actually just got a rank 1 on Vezax using this setup last week, so I can guarantee that it really does work. Now, what are we doing here that's different from what we were doing in the set it and forget it talent setup? Really, so we're taking 5 points out of Improved Mind Blast and 1 point out of Veiled Shadows, and I'll talk about that in a second. We're putting them into more threat reduction with Shadow Affinity. We're getting that 3rd point in Focused Mind. I removed the points in Improved Shadow Form because these fights don't have any pushback protection, or they don't have anything that's affecting spell pushback, so it doesn't matter. And then going over to the disc tree, this is just a point to get down to the next tier, this one in Improved Power Word Shield. And then we're getting Mental Agility, which reduces the mana cost of your instant cast spells by 10%. So that's really for Vezax, most specifically for Devouring Plague. That is our spell that costs the most amount of mana. And reducing it by 10% really helps. It's about, I think it's 900 mana before taking this into account. So it's really helpful on those longer Vezax kills. Now, why are we doing this? On these fights, we're not casting Mind Blast as often. So taking out Improved Mind Blast, not really a big deal, doesn't really affect us. The reduced threat generation is really nice. As I mentioned, Shadow has 30% threat reduction baked into Shadow Form, but with the additional Shadow threat reduction from Shadow Affinity, we can just straight pump and have no issue, no worries of pulling threat whatsoever. This is really important on the Animus when that first spawns in Vezax. You can just go full send into that, and you're not gonna, you have 55%. Well, it doesn't quite add, it's not additive, it's multiplicative, which means you have less than 55%. But you have a ton of threat reduction, which means you can just pump into that Animus, and if your tanks are doing what they should be doing, you're not going to have to worry about pulling threat whatsoever. That's going to be your Warlocks and your Mages doing that. So just having that is really nice. Same thing on Hodir. If you just get some, juicy crits in that first, when you get that, what is it called? The lightning buff, whatever it's called. If you get a ton of crits in that first window there, you're not going to have to worry about pulling threat. Now, why 1 out of 2 points in Veiled Shadows? Well, this reduces the cooldown on Fade by 3 seconds and reduces the cooldown of Shadow Fiend by 1 minute. losing those is not a problem because we're not casting Fade on cooldown. It's something that if we need it, we will use it, but you shouldn't. That's the whole point of getting the extra threat reduction. But let's talk about Shadow Fiend. Well, Hodir, if you're doing it on hard mode, is going to be a faster than 2-minute fight, which means you only get one Shadow Fiend use anyway. And then Vezax, you're time gated because of the Animus spawn, and you're only going to get 2 Shadow Fiends, whether it's a 3-minute cooldown or a 4-minute cooldown. So you're not affecting your fight there either. And then this just gives us that extra points so that we can get everything we want from Shadow Affinity and Mental Agility. You could take a point out of Dispersion. It's not really necessary. That's just kind of what I like for those oh shit moments. So it's something that I personally didn't want to take out, but I've seen other people do it. I find this to be a much safer way to operate because this talent point doesn't affect us whatsoever, at least for me. So this is the setup that I would go for Vezax or Hodir. Now, I have seen some people talk about just kind of going back to the set and forget it talents. You know, what about if we want to get improved Vampiric Embrace? Because that passive healing can be really nice if your healers are struggling on, you know, a lot of passive damage that's just happening over time. So it doesn't really work on damage that's chunky. So what I mean by chunky damage is like Algalon, for example. You have the Cosmic Smashes, you have the Star Explosions. Those just kind of happen in an instant, and they deal a lot of damage. But then there's a lot of downtime in between, which means you've a lot of time for your healers to heal up. So improved Vampiric Brace doesn't really help a ton there, but it would be really good, I think, on XT for just like that constant life spark damage. So if the life sparks are in melee or in range, like whatever group they're in, if you just put yourself into that group, then you just can heal up whoever's taking the most damage pretty passively, which would be really nice and helpful. If you're going to put 2 points into this, I would, depending on the fight, I would probably take them out of improved shadow form, because if you're not getting pushback, then this talent is a little bit useless. It's kind of a catch-all that I like for most fights. But if you really do want that improved Vampiric Embrace, that's probably what I would do. If mana's not an issue, you could also take it out of Focused Mind. So that would just obviously look like that instead. So those are kind of the ways that I would maneuver the talent tree if you wanted to take improved Vampiric Embrace. It's a really nice utility spell. I've never actually played with it, to be honest, in Wrath of the Lich King. I haven't ever had a need for it, and I think that's the thing about that talent is it really depends on your raid, on your healers, and what your needs are. So it's definitely useful. You know, talk with your healers, talk with your raid, see if it would be beneficial. I highly recommend that you do all you can as a Shadow Priest because they have a ton of utility and you can really help out your raid a ton. All right, now let's talk about glyphs. So again, this is kind of what I said as your set it and forget it talent, or I'm sorry, glyph setup. But what if we want to, you know, min-max a little bit more? How can we do that? So let's talk about Glyph of Shadow Word Pain. So unfortunately, it does not give haste to our Shadow Word Pain, but it does give us 1% of our base mana back per tick of Shadow Word Pain. Now, it's a little bit disappointing when you do the math on it because your base mana is not what you see like on your character when you're fully geared out. If you take off all of your gear, that's what your base mana is. And I think it's around 4,000 or 4,500 when you take off all of your gear, which means 1% of your base mana is about 40 mana. So every 3 seconds on a single target fight, you're getting 40 mana back per tick of Shadow Word Pain. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it's not great. I think on a 3-minute fight, on a 3-minute single target fight, it's around 2,400 mana that you get back, which definitely is beneficial. Like if you don't need Glyph of Dispersion, then you might as well take this if you're running out of mana. And I think the fight where this is the most useful would be XT hard mode, because even like my guild's kills are really fast. We're around 3 minutes. I still find myself running out of mana. On our last kill, the last global of the fight just before the boss died was a mind flay, and I didn't have enough mana to cast another mind flay after that. Like I ended the fight perfectly at 0, which was great, but a little bit scary. And I think next time I do that fight, I'm gonna have a Glyph of Shadow Word Pain instead of Dispersion. And I know when our fights were longer, like 4 minutes when we first started doing XT hard mode, I was using a mana potion instead of a haste because I couldn't afford to lose I needed that extra mana to finish the fight. So I think on longer fights that don't have an intermission where you can disperse for mana, Glyph of Shadow Word Pain can actually be pretty useful. If all it does is prevent you from have to using a mana potion and instead you can use a haste or a wild magic, that's already a pretty decent gain, just in terms of the utility it's providing you. Now, the next one I want to talk about is Mind Sear. So Glyph of Mind Sear is something that, again, has another, it's niche, but it can still be useful to increase your damage by a lot. So it increases the radius of effect on Mind Sear by 5 yards, which means you're just affecting like a wider area when you cast that Mind Sear. Now, there's two areas where I think the Glyph of Mind Sear is actually really good. The first is if you do any speed running, then you know that the mobs, like the trash, are not always grouped up together. You're kind of like constantly running forward and your tanks are trying to grab as much as possible and you're just constantly trying to AoE as much as you can. So in those situations, I think the Glyph of Mind Sear actually does really well because you can hit all of the enemies, or at least most of them, even though they might not be grouped up. And even though you might want dispersion because you can disperse more, you can get more mana back. If you're hitting more enemies, that means that's less spells that you have to cast to kill all of them, which means you should be saving mana by using the Glyph of Mind Sear. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be equal to what you'd get from Glyph of Dispersion, but it does save you mana because you don't need to cast as many spells to kill the enemies. So I think that's one area where the Glyph of Mind Sear is actually really good. The one boss fight where I think this is really good would be Freya, especially on the Lashers. So on the Lashers, and then when you have the 3 elemental guys up, after you dot them up, or not really in the case for the Lashers, but you want to Mind Sear off of Freya. And if those things aren't right next to Freya, your Mind Sear is not going to hit them if it's not glyphed. So having this just really helps facilitate that AoE damage to make sure that you're hitting everything in the fight. So I would highly recommend you use Glyph of Mind Sear as your third glyph for that fight. Now, the final glyph I want to talk about, and this is one I would recommend never using, is the Glyph of Shadow or Death. Now, this is more of just like a PSA. Don't ever use this. It's a bunch of crap. And there actually are a few niche uses where it is the technically best third glyph. But I'll talk about that as well. So why do I say never use this? Well, targets below 35% health take an additional 10% damage from your Shadow or Death. Right now on like a 3-minute fight, I think optimally you're probably using Shadow or Death about 3 to 4 times. It's only in a rare circumstance where you need to reapply a dot. And specifically under 35%, you might have 1 or 2 casts over a 3-minute fight where you're getting that extra 10% damage. So if the average Shadow or Death does 7k damage, depending on your gear, it could be plus or minus 1,000 there. That means you're getting like 1,400 extra damage in a 3-minute fight. If you use Shadow or Death twice below 35%, that's 8 DPS on a 3-minute fight. So is it an increase? Technically, yes, but I think the utility that the other glyphs provide increases your DPS by more than this, even though this is the only like raw output DPS gain glyph that Shadow Priest has. So it's not great. And I think the only time that this is worth using as a third glyph is, if you're speed killing a fight, and it's going to be a really short fight, like a minute, maybe like basically you don't need to worry about running out of mana. Glyph of Mind Sear would be useless. So Glyph of Dispersion would be useless. And you're probably going to Shadow or Death like once. You probably won't have enough time to Shadow or Death twice, at least in an optimal circumstance under 35% health. So you're basically getting 10% additional damage on 1 Shadow or Death before the boss dies in that like final global. Can't say it's the best use, but it's probably better than whatever third glyph you're having. But yeah, outside of that circumstance, this glyph is just really crappy and just not worth using. So that's just kind of my PSA on Glyph of Shadow or Death. There's nothing else here that is anything that we would ever want to use. Everything is just like healing or like, mind control, which hopefully we never have to use again. I'm so sick of mind controlling. I hate it. But that's really it from a major glyph perspective. Now, for your minors, really just all depends on you. I really like these 3. So I talked about why I like Shadow Fiend. Levitate's just nice because if you want to use Levitate, I just use it randomly throughout a dungeon or throughout a raid, and just not having to go buy light feathers is really nice. That would just be really annoying if I had to keep doing that. And then I really do like Glyph of Fortitude because especially on like Algalon or like your tougher fights, when you have people who die in the middle of the fight and you need to rebuff them, The fact that Fortitude costs so much mana, if you reduce that by 50%, can actually save you mana throughout the fight. So if you're, if you have like 6 people die on Algalon and, you use all your battle reses and your soul stones, or your shamans use their resurrection ability, that could be a lot of people that you're buffing if it doesn't all happen at the same time and you're not just using one big like raid-wide Fortitude. So this does save you a lot of mana in those circumstances. So that's why I'd recommend this as your third minor glyph. You could use Shadow Protection, which is like a nice quality of life thing, but I don't think that really saves you much. You might cast it 1 or 2 less times over a full raid, but who cares? That's kind of how I feel about that. And our Disc Priest always has this one glyphed as well, so it's nothing that I ever need to worry about. But anyway, that's it on minor and major glyphs. So I hope this video was helpful. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you find any other uses for Glyph of Shadow or Death that I didn't mention here. Let me know. I'm happy to hear it. But anyway, that's all for this video. I hope this was helpful. Feel free to reach out if you have any comments or questions. But anyway, my name's Pantsface, and I'll see you in the next one.